Hi, I'm Claire Hurley. I'm a lecturer in the English department at the University of Kent, and today I'm going to be talking about The Awakening by Kate Chopin, which is one of my favourite books. Okay, so as you may know, from the 1960s onwards, Western feminist critics have often praised The Awakening as a kind of early feminist text. And it's because the protagonist, Edna Pontellier, attempts to free herself from social and imaginative constraints. But spoiler alert, I don't know if you've actually finished the novel or not, but the final scene in the novel with Edna's swim kind of casts shadow over this question of whether the text is feminist or not. And it seems to complicate the novel in some ways. Does Edna in the end discover a better, freer way of being beyond social orthodoxies? Or does she just wander, quote, idly, aimlessly, unthinking and unguided, to quote from the novel, into an existential dead end? Is Edna's awakening a process of enchantment or disenchantment, a movement towards self-knowledge or a movement towards self-delusion? So you might have already thought about this text as being feminist and how it kind of represents gender and marriage. So in this video today, I'm going to kind of present an alternative case for the novel, and that is to read Edna's awakening not through an idea of gender, but actually through an idea of race instead. For what I'm going to argue is that this novel can't simply be understood as representing a universal kind of feminist awakening. That would be a kind of misconception. Instead, throughout the text, Chopin reveals to us the status of Edna Pontellier as a white middle-class woman. So what Edna eventually cannot escape from then is the centrality of her own whiteness, or her own kind of white privilege, if you want to use more contemporary language. And so I think for me, her own whiteness is a place that we can locate the failure of Edna's kind of feminist awakening. And I'm going to talk a bit more about that in this video and talk about, why it is that race plays such an important role in this text for me. But first of all, let me just introduce you to what I mean by whiteness and what we can understand that term to mean. So whiteness studies, which is a kind of area of research, attempts to trace the economic and political history behind the invention of whiteness, to challenge the privileges given to so-called whites, and to analyse the cultural practices in art, music, literature and popular media that create and perpetuate the fiction of whiteness. So what this is saying basically is that the whole idea of whiteness itself is a fiction, right? We kind of know now from biology and from science that race doesn't really exist. It's all kind of invented. And so whiteness then itself as a race is also kind of an invention. So I'll carry on reading. At bottom, whiteness is an ideological fiction, so it's a lie. Naming those properties supposedly unique to white people, properties used to claim that they are, quote, a superior race and the norm by which others are judged. Whiteness is also, or above all else, a legal fiction, determining the distribution of wealth, power, human rights, and citizenship among bodies dominated by this fiction. So if you think about, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement at the moment, which is trying to understand racism and trying to fight against it, whiteness could also be seen as the kind of opposite of that on that spectrum. So whiteness is the embodiment of power as it appears kind of in different institutions. So whether that's through the education system or the criminal justice system, it's kind of not just about individual white people, but actually all the structures of racism that create society. So particularly in the USA, I'm thinking about here. And so what I'm going to argue is that The Awakening is actually a kind of pioneering critique of whiteness and of the fantasy of whiteness. And I'm getting this critique from Chopin herself. as her previous literary texts demonstrate an interest in race and racism. For example, Susan Costello has written on race and ethnicity in Chopin's fiction, that Kate Chopin was throughout her lifetime exposed to racial and ethnic diversity. During her early childhood in St. Louis, her family owned 6 slaves, and a male slave was charged with holding her pony when she rode. Interestingly, according to Chopin's biographer Emily Toth, the 3 oldest slaves belonging to the O'Flaherty family were recorded by the census as blacks, while the 3 younger were classified as mulattoes. The paternity of the latter is not known. On the Charlottesville side of Chopin's family, there were cases of relationships between male members of the family and women of colour. So I think what this quote is really interesting and revealing is the fact of the complexity of race during this period. So even if you had slaves, it's quite possible that the paternity of those slaves might have been from a white man or from the white slave owner. So even within Chopin's immediate family, there were clearly questions around who was in her family, who were the slaves, and who had fathered which slaves, which I think just reveals the complexity of the kind of racial picture that Chopin's working with here. So what I want to do now is to close read a couple of passages from the text itself in order to kind of convey this complexity of race and also the place of whiteness within that. So I'm first going to turn to the kind of opening scene of the novel. And as you may know from this opening scene, Edna's husband, Léonce Pontillier, is rendered as a kind of caricature of a bourgeois white gentleman. He's seated in a rocking chair with his cigar, his eyeglasses and his newspaper, observing the activities of others from afar, and all the while restless and disgusted despite or because of his excess of comfort. So what we might understand from this scene is that, the scene we're presented with at the opening of the novel is a kind of space of suffocating whiteness. And I think you can see that from this quote as well, that I'm also going to read out. Madame Lebrun was bustling in and out, giving orders in a high key to a yard boy whenever she got inside the house, and directions in an equally high voice to a dining room servant whenever she got outside. So there's a clear power dynamic being established in this scene. So you have the white people who are have all the power, have all the privilege, and are ordering about their servants. She was a fresh, pretty woman clad always in white with elbow sleeves. So she's wearing white, perhaps as a kind of representation of her skin colour, so it's enhancing her skin colour, her whiteness. Her starched skirts crinkled as she came and went. Starched, again, an idea of whiteness here, that you're kind of bleaching out colour. Farther down, before one of the cottages, a lady in black was walking demurely up and down, telling her beads. Mr. Pontillier's 2 children were there, sturdy little fellows of 4 and 5. A quadroon nurse followed them about with a faraway, meditative air. So I think the first word that strikes me from this passage is the word quadroon, which is now an offensive term. And that's a word that indicates a person who is by descent 3/4 white and 1/4 black. So this nurse is being identified by her race and the fact that she's mixed race. And I think what's also important to notice here is the fact that you've got the white people ordering about the mixed race or the racialized servants and people working for the family. And I think what's interesting here, if we think about the role of Edna and how she's able to escape her family in some ways, is that the reason she's able to escape her kind of domestic life and her family commitments is because you've got a mixed race woman doing the childcare. So she leaves her children in the care of another woman, a black woman. So in some ways, Edna's able to have this kind of voyage of self-discovery purely because that labour of childcare and her marriage as well is being left to the black woman. So I'm going to move on to another quote now. So Mr. Pontillier finally lit a cigar and began to smoke. letting the paper drag idly from his hand. He fixed his gaze upon a white sunshade that was advancing at a snail's pace from the beach. "You are burnt beyond recognition," he added, looking at his wife as one looks at a valuable piece of personal property which has suffered some damage. So this is a very interesting quote, because clearly we have Mr. Pontillier being very angry at his wife for being burnt, and that sense of being burnt, so being burnt from being white into, I guess, becoming a kind of pink colour or a slightly darker shade, indicates that damage has been done. So we can look at this through the lens of feminism and think about why it is that Edna is kind of being seen as personal property, or the property of her husband. But I think what's also another lens we could look at here is through race, and think about why he's so angry with her when she's basically kind of not fulfilling her role as a white kind of wife. At this moment, she's become burnt, and that's the real issue that Mr. Pontillier has with her. And sort of by contrast, if we look at Madame Ratignola, she's the kind of complete opposite of this. So we have this quote from chapter 7. Madame Ratignola, more careful of her complexion, had twinned a gauze veil about her head. She wore dogskin gloves with gauntlets that protected her wrists. She was dressed in pure white. So, as you might have already discussed, Madame Ratignola is a kind of exemplary woman in many ways. She's the model wife, she's the model mother. And in this description, we also see her as being a kind of model white woman. So she is completely covering her body in order to protect it from the sun, even down to her wrists. So no part of her body is going to be exposed to the sun. Her whiteness, in other words, is being entirely protected. And again, we get that comment that she was dressed in pure white. So she's not only an example of kind of pure femininity then, but also pure and performative whiteness. She is very much living up to the standards of the society that are being imposed on her in a way that Edna is not. So now kind of midway through the novel, we have a kind of moment, an interesting moment. There's a scene with a dinner party where we have a moment which seems a kind of almost like a moment of potential for Edna, that she might be able to achieve this kind of life she so desires. And that's also interesting to me because it's also being read in terms of race. And I'll point this out here. So it's chapter 30. The golden shimmer of Edna's satin gown spread in her rich folds on either side of her. There was a soft fall of lace encircling her shoulders. It was the colour of her skin without the glow, the myriad living tints that one may sometimes discover in vibrant flesh. So what's interesting about this quote is there seems to be a potential here to move away from the suffocation of whiteness. So Edna herself is embodying a kind of otherness, or a potential for otherness, the myriad living tints that may sometimes discover in vibrant flesh. So there's a really interesting promise here of kind of the potential to understand other forms of race, or to even embody them in this moment. But it is only a moment, and then after this we see Edna and Edna's character kind of retreat and become even more depressed. And even later on after this scene, we see Edna visit, quote, darkies with her children. So we kind of fall back into those categories of white and black, and there isn't this potential for kind of anything new or revolutionary happening in terms of race. So I'm going to move on now to the final scene of the novel. And again, I'm just going to pick out the kind of colouring of this scene, which I find really interesting. So, the final chapter. The water of the gulf stretched out before her, gleaming with the million lights of the sun. The voice of the sea is seductive, never ceasing, whispering, clamouring, murmuring, inviting the soul to wander in abysses of solitude. All along the white beach, up and down, there was no living thing in sight. So we have in this scene a kind of bleaching of the landscape here. The final scene, which is kind of Edna's death scene, is bleached of colour. Only whiteness prevails, the white beach, the lights of the sun. So in a way, this is this kind of inescapability of Edna's racial identity here. So she is a white woman, and in this final scene, everything else seems to reflect that. And so these other final lines, the water was deep, but she lifted her white body and reached out with a long sweeping stroke. Again, it's just highlighting the whiteness that she embodies. And that seems to be a kind of final iteration of Edna, her white body. So let me just finally conclude then. And I think also it's worth noting in this scene the word solitude. So this is Edna at the end on her own. She is alone in this scene. So what I'm going to argue then is that Edna's failure within the awakening is precisely because her focus is purely individual, and she fails to recognise the need to work collectively and in solidarity with other women, and particularly with women of colour. While she goes on her individual journey of enlightenment, her children are cared for by black women. So Edna is in some ways very privileged. She has a form of white privilege that enables her to have the kind of solitude that she desires in order to have this kind of awakening. But the point of feminism is that women should work together in order to kind of deconstruct the patriarchy. So women of all different races need to work collectively. So I'm just going to finish with this quote from Bell Hooks, which says, "As long as women are using class or race power to dominate other women, feminist sisterhood cannot be realised." And I think this is the failure of the awakening, is that there's no sense in which there's a kind of sisterhood emerging between Edna and women of other races. So in fact, what Edna is doing in the awakening then is simply kind of utilising her white privilege in order to have her own self-discovery, but not create any kind of political or social bonds with other women. And that, to me, is why the book doesn't work. But I am reading this through a kind of contemporary lens and thinking about particularly intersectionality and kind of contemporary feminism in order to understand it. Thank you.